Shadow the Hedgehog is cringe, and that's a good thing. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is about to come out, and it's adapting elements from Sonic Adventure 2, one of the most popular Sonic games of all time. As of the time of this recording, the film has not come out yet, though I believe as of its release, it will be out. We're getting Shadow the Hedgehog, portrayed by Keanu Reeves, and in his complete gun-toting, fast, cosmically powered glory that we got from years and years ago. It feels like something that came out of the mid-2000s when Linkin Park and Evanescence were on the radio all the time. Fans of the franchise have been hyped to see Shadow. Ever since the first film came out, people were going like, when Shadow show up? Even before Tails and Knuckles, they were saying, when does Shadow arrive? And it's clear the fandom adores Shadow the Hedgehog. Each Sonic film, it's really interesting, they've been building momentum. Each film has been pushing the world, pushing the lore further and further past the conventions of standardized storytelling. What we consider to be accessible for a mainstream audience, proving that audiences will just watch about anything if it's good. What you can put a hedgehog punching an echidna as a giant robot looms over them, and they'll show up, and people are hyped for Shadow. Many people think that Shadow the Hedgehog will plow down Mufasa, its competition this weekend, worse than the wildebeests did to Mufasa back 30 years ago. That's kind of wild, right? That we're even discussing a Sonic film beating a Lion King movie. Lion King being one of the highest grossing animated films of all time, and its live action adaptation being one of the highest grossing films ever. But that's just the level of hype behind Shadow. It seems kind of funny, right? As a longtime fan of the Sonic franchise, I think back to when Shadow the Hedgehog, the game, first came out, and it came out not to cheers, but to jeers. People were mocking the game on release, upon its announcement even, for being so edgy.
This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me. I've caused so much destruction. I should never have been created.
Shadow, you're an asshole, man.
You are what you eat, Sonic.
What the hell, man?
Too dark for me, one might say. The game tried to push the boundaries of what Sonic could show by having Shadow swear for the first time in a Sonic game, trying to really be edgy and push that T rating to the max.
Where's that damn fourth Chaos Emerald? Damn it.
But it's interesting, isn't it? In an era where cringe content has become currency, I'm kind of surprised Sonic the Hedgehog has been spared of the treatment that so many other works of fiction have. It's sped quickly into the ranks of mimeticism beyond even that. Sonic exists in a weird liminal state in modern society, and Shadow the Hedgehog, I think, is the embodiment of that place that it stands in. Between the Sonichu memes and the type your name in the DeviantArt and add the Hedgehog at the end, it felt like for a while Sonic was being delegated to cringe culture, to being something that was mocked and ridiculed by many. But that has since changed, thankfully. It's been embraced, but for a while it wasn't. With this video, I want to go into a few different things. Why did Sonic the Hedgehog become the butt end of so many jokes? Why was Shadow, in many ways, the embodiment of all that was mocked about Sonic and all that is now celebrated about Sonic? And in an era where we are more self-conscious than ever about what we say and how we present ourselves, how is Sonic so distinct and impactful in our day-to-day existence? Sonic the Hedgehog was created at first to be something cool, to be the competition Sega needed against Mario, who had kind of taken over the video game landscape.
It's all too easy to draw parallels between Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog. The classic mascot characters have endured the years to become video game icons, recognised and loved by millions of game addicts around the globe. Nintendo's fat Italian plumber helped pioneer the platformer genre, and Sega's Blue Hedgehog transformed it completely, placing a new emphasis on speed and roller coaster inspired level designs. In the old days, Mario and Sonic stood on even ground, each taking lead roles in an impressive selection of critically acclaimed titles. But as the years passed and consoles become more and more powerful, Mario's inevitable jump to the third dimension fared much better than Sonic's. Case in point, Super Mario 64 is remembered even today as one of the greatest games of all time. Sonic Adventure for Sega Dreamcast is conversely thought of as a flawed but still enjoyable sequel by hardcore fans, and an altogether broken platformer by everybody else.
Now Mario is kind of a universal character, right? He's built on archetypes, he is immediately iconic, simple to play, and the games were challenging but fair to anyone who picked them up. Sega needed a couple things. They needed a mascot who could be as popular as Mario. They needed a gameplay mechanic that could be easily picked up and played just like Mario could. and they needed it to be a world that they could build upon and develop over time. And that's where Sonic comes in. Sonic was designed to be cool, to appeal to everything that audiences at the time thought was cool, mainly kids. He was meant to be speedy and fast and extreme. But the thing about being cool is that cool is always ephemeral. Mario was not designed to be cool. But the thing about Mario is he was universally understood. You got what his deal was immediately. Imagine for a second you're picking up Mario for the first time. You are playing a guy who's running from left to right to save a princess from a castle. She's being held by a monster. Simple, direct. You don't need to know who the Mushroom Kingdom is. You don't need to know the princess's name. You don't need to know that Bowser is a giant reptile or a turtle or a dragon. None of that matters. It's universal archetypes applied in a simple formula. It's a story you've heard 1,000 times. Without knowing his lore, you get it. Sonic, though, a little harder to understand. Like, you're attacking these robots, but the robots have animals in them, so what's going on? Are they imprisoned? Who's this big fat guy, this egg-shaped scientist who keeps attacking him? What's his deal? It's not as easily understood without diving into the lore, which is, I think, also why, even in an early era, Sonic fans were interested in what the mechanics of the story were. And of course, in the early years, they had no shortage of explanations. Between the multiple cartoons, the sprawling Archie comic series, and several individual games, even an anime OVA, actually, for that matter, the lore of Sonic was built up by many different arbiters of the information. Things shifted depending on who you talked to, depending on which version of the lore you were reading. The video games had a different story than the comics, had a different story than the cartoons, and they all diverged in different directions that made them very complicated to really figure out. This dichotomy between the super serious and super silly can even be seen in the difference between the Sat.AM Sonic and the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons, both of which ran simultaneously alongside each other. Both depict a similar world with similar characters, with similar character designs, but in one it's a super serious melodrama about saving the world, rebellion, fighting, etc., whereas in the other it's a light-hearted, Looney Tunes-esque chase show. This dichotomy was felt so early on that even in its infancy, Sonic couldn't seem to pick a side. Was it a serious epic, or was it a childish cartoon? Both seemed to exist simultaneously, and as both interpretations went on and on and on, they further diverged individually from each other. What at first seemed like companion pieces soon became incompatible pieces of storytelling, as Sat.AM and the Adventures diverged further and further as things escalated down their own individual paths. And thus the question became, was Sonic a cartoon, or was Sonic a melodrama? Add to that the lack of games in the Sega Saturn. Sonic really struggled after his initial run of video games. The great run of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Sonic CD, and Sonic & Knuckles. Those 5 games established the core of Sonic's identity that every single spin-off material tried to lift from after the fact. You know, you look at that too, there are multiple nemesis rival characters established for Sonic at that time. You got Metal Sonic and you got Knuckles. Metal Sonic does, I think, bear a lot of similarity to Shadow. Metal Sonic is just a mechanical version of Sonic, and there are multiple metal-ish Sonic characters in the games. Like there's Mecha Sonic, I think, in 2, but Metal Sonic in Sonic CD really established something, that there was this evil version of Sonic that stuck in the consciousness of fans.
When I first heard the words Sonic's arch-rival and Sonic's doppelganger in the design notes, an image for that character's design immediately came to me, in almost complete form. Metal naturally fit into our key visual concept for Sonic CD as well, and from the first moment that I imagined his red iris set against the darkness of his black eyes, I knew that he would become a character with real lasting appeal. As a result, Metal Sonic continues to appear in the newer Sonic games, and many people in Europe and America enjoy drawing fan art of him, for which I am grateful. This was something I thought about later when I designed Shadow the Hedgehog 2, but seeing as Metal Sonic was a rival character to Sonic, I knew the best way to show that off would be with an in-game scene where Sonic and Metal Sonic directly compete with each other, and I designed Metal Sonic with that scene in mind.
And Metal Sonic would come back. I think Sonic Heroes especially presented Metal Sonic as true big bad material if given the opportunity. But there was also not seemingly a lot to go off with Metal Sonic. He's just another robot. Sonic fights robots all the time. There's nothing distinct about him beyond that from an outside glance. It's just another one of Eggman's machines. Keep in mind, I'm talking about Metal Sonic prior to the anime OVA, prior to Sonic Heroes, back when he was just a really cool design. But to the designer's credit, much of what made Metal Sonic a fan favorite for a very long time was that design and how it informed players' opinion of the character. But Knuckles was a little different. Knuckles is, I think, to Sonic what Piccolo is to Goku. And I'm drawing Dragon Ball comparisons in the Sonic video, big shock. Both Piccolo and Knuckles are essentially these enemy characters who are associated with these 7 collectible items tied in with the greater lore of the saga. It helps embellish and develop this world in a way that's very compelling. And they're both opposing the antagonist after an older villain who requires the aid of mechanics to fight the hero, tricks and manipulates them into being their willing partner. But over time, thanks to many confrontations and battles, both Piccolo and Goku, and both Knuckles and Sonic become companions. Lifelong companions, at that. I think that's a very interesting concept, though of course, I am leaving a lot of details out, like Piccolo being a demon king who existed for thousands of years, etc., etc. I digress. Sonic and Dragon Ball Z have a lot of comparisons. It's not the last time I'm going to compare Sonic to Dragon Ball Z, by the way. When we get to Shadow, we're going to draw a comparison to Vegeta, obviously. But again, none of these characters were true rivals to Sonic. They were just adversaries, and in one case, adversary turned friend. But during the Sega Saturn era, that's where Sonic really lost its muster. You had these diverging continuities, all giving a different portrait of Sonic that was vastly different than what gamers saw in the games. This separation of continuities was a little overwhelming to young Sonic fans. Add to that, though, the bigger issue, that the fads that Sonic had been built upon were starting to fizzle out. In the late 90s, you got into the grunge era, you got into metal getting a big hit again, the goth scene really taking off. So new stuff was becoming popular and edgy and cool. Add to that the addition of anime. Dragon Ball Z becoming popular, I think, really did help with the Dragon Ballization, the animification of Sonic in many ways. The more lore you got, the bigger worlds you got. And while Sonic tried getting games for the Saturn, there never really was that big Sonic game. Sonic Extreme, famously, never came out. And while Sonic R, I think Sonic R gets overhated. Like, listen, if you take away the sloppy gameplay, the bad graphics, the limited character selection, the awkward level design, the gameplay mechanics of it all, the fact that it wasn't Mario Kart when Mario Kart was outdoing it. When you take all that away, you're left kind of with the aesthetics that are poorly rendered through gameplay and design and all that. But what you have left is pretty good, I think. All that's left after you take away the music, gameplay mechanics, character selection, level design, and all that. Yeah, great game aside from that. Fantastic. Approval there.
This is very hard to control. Wow, this is super hard to control. Oh my gosh!
So wiggly. Oh, I gotta go back to the D-pad. This sucks.
Dude, nothing works. Like, up is bad, left is bad, and right is, it's all bad.
So when it came time for the Dreamcast, Sonic needed a reinvention. You can really divide the Sonic fandom from pre-adventure and post-adventure. Sonic Adventure really established this greater set of characters, this world, this lore, that audiences could get the hang of and really enjoy. Granted, there were problems, like the terrible facial animation in Sonic Adventure, but fans could overlook that if the gameplay was interesting. And they added some more gravitas to the characters. There's a tragic backstory behind Chaos, the big bad of the game. Robotnik, Eggman, while still a good villain, he took a side seat for a while, with new antagonists coming in to supplant Eggman. To show while Eggman was a big deal and was still a threat, he was ultimately supplanted by this greater enemy. He was the foe back then, but we gotta get to something bigger now. Instead of Eggman, you have Chaos, this eldritch abomination who exists, who's also tied in with the lore of the Master Emerald and all that, and the Echidnas and all that. All of that is really cool. I like Chaos quite a bit as an antagonist. He is a very intimidating figure, and he has kind of that Cell dynamic from Dragon Ball Z, where he has to collect and assimilate these items of power. In Cell's case, the androids. In Chaos's case, the Chaos Emeralds, and become more powerful, and ultimately leads to a big fight. Kaiju fighting is always great. For Sonic Adventure's weaknesses, there were some characters that weren't so great, like Big the Cat. No one cares about Big the Cat. No one likes Big the Cat. He's just there. But if Chaos did have a flaw, it was that he was fairly boring for most of the game. He is just this thing that Eggman is building up, powering up, and then he becomes a kaiju fight. He's a force of nature, yes, but as an individual character with pathos and ethos, he's not particularly compelling. We never get inside of Chaos's head, we don't really understand his motivation all that much until very late in the game, and he is, as a foil to any individual character, quite weak. It's clear that Sega, when planning their next main antagonist, considered making a foil to Sonic more than anything else. Sonic Adventure 2, they go, okay, let's give Sonic a one-off character, the evil Sonic. This is to Sonic what Vegeta is to Goku. Enter Shadow. Shadow the Hedgehog in Sonic Adventure 2 was everything that was cool at the time. He's dark, he's edgy, he's got a very sad backstory. He probably listened to Evanescence and Linkin Park on repeat while skidding across the land. Even what informs his character design is very interesting. He had these rocket-propelled shoes.
I think the most appealing thing about Shadow is his deep backstory. His anti-hero persona comes from his memories of the past and can't be expressed by simple words or through anger, sorrow, or love. I think fans are drawn to his story and his fate, and of course, he looks really cool. Shadow's design hasn't really changed, and I like the depiction of Shadow in the Paramount movie. Regarding the original Shadow design, various approaches were tried, but finally settling on a design that fans approved of and that has endured ever since. When designing Shadow, I wanted to create a character with that sense of speed to rival that of Sonic himself. Sonic's speed is a result of running very fast, and it would be boring if a new character achieved their speed in the same way. So I thought back to when I designed Metal Sonic, who achieves his high speeds via a jet engine, and I also drew inspiration from speed skaters, giving Shadow his own unique ability that allows him to achieve the same speed as Sonic, but in a different way.
He could harness the Chaos Emeralds to basically stop time and teleport around, using it as a weapon, this raw power, in a way that Sonic just couldn't do. That was really interesting. Again, they tied him back to the greater lore of Sonic, to the Robotnik family, to that whole history. And the stakes went higher than ever. It's not just simply kidnapping some animals, causing some pollution. No, it's the entire world's gonna go and Shadow wants to watch it burn. That stuff is cool and interesting, especially to a young audience who is very impressionable. And they had it be a real dynamic between the good and bad teams. You could choose sides, adding moral ambiguity to a game that otherwise was very black and white. And again, this game is also very black and white. You can be either the good guys or the bad guys. And what kid doesn't want to play the bad guy every so often, right? Even though Rouge the Bat's kind of like morally ambiguous and probably caused a lot of kids to question many things that I'm sure they're not working out on furaffinity.com right now. But I digress. The thing though also about Shadow is that while his backstory is very compelling and is very dark, it's also kind of goofy. Like, it's a little silly, right? Shadow was created by Gerald Robotnik, Eggman's grandfather, as part of this government program called Project Shadow. Now, we know Gerald Robotnik is this renowned scientist who created a space colony called ARK, the first space colony in the Sonic universe. So Project Shadow's aim is to figure out a way to make people immortal. So Gerald is interested. He happens to have a granddaughter named Maria. And Maria is terminally ill. So we have a clear setup, an emotional through line. You get the idea. So Gerald creates two life forms, a prototype which happens to be a gigantic kaiju lizard who can merge with the space colony ARK, and a talking hedgehog. And sure, Gerald maybe needed the power of the Chaos Emeralds to make Shadow, and maybe sort of made a deal with alien Satan, but he managed to create the ultimate life form, so it's all worth it, right? Of course, Gerald realizes that the government is probably going to use Shadow as a weapon, so he tries to teach Shadow humanity. He sets up Shadow and Maria as playmates, and the two become incredibly close. Of course, all Gerald's really doing is just setting the groundwork for Shadow's tragic backstory, and like any good fire, you need a little bit of kindling to get the flame burning. The government, who, I remind you, contracted Gerald to make Shadow, then goes, hey, I think this ultimate life form thing might be a little too dangerous for society. So Gun, a covert military outfit, launches a siege on Ark to capture both Gerald and Shadow. In the process, they end up killing Maria right in front of Shadow, destroying the one thing he loved in the world. On paper, that is every single edgy anime boy's motivation, right? That's the Sasuke Uchiha motivation. But what makes it kind of funny is that these scenes are played completely straight between this fairly well-rendered human character and a hedgehog. Like, there's something inherently comical about that is not intended. You're supposed to take this fully seriously at face value, but it's so... The juxtaposition of the imagery is so ludicrous, it's kind of funny in a way that's unintentional. I think it's kind of cool. It's completely not what they intended, but it is so funny to look at. And Gerald, now having lost his beloved granddaughter, decides the only option left is to destroy everything. And Shadow, yeah, he's totally on board with it. When he's revived decades later by Eggman, he immediately decides to finish the job his creator started. Sure, Eggman is the obvious villain of the game at first, seemingly in control of everything, but Shadow's the one who ultimately sets in motion a series of events necessary to destroy the Earth, with the Bio-Lizard, the prototype of the ultimate life form. Much like Vegeta, though, in Dragon Ball Z, Shadow goes through a redemption arc. It's only when Amy Rose tries appealing to Shadow's humanity that Shadow has a change of heart and decides maybe mankind does deserve a chance, in part because Maria, the only person he truly cared about, values human life. And then he dies.
Maria, this is what you wanted, right? This is my promise I made to you.
Got better.
Kind of. On paper, Eggman's basically doing the same thing he did in the last adventure game. Shadow and Chaos are really both old entities who Eggman half understands and blindly thinks he can control, who are also tied up with the Chaos Emeralds, who he uses in part as a bid for power, but then things spiral out of control fast. What makes Shadow interesting is his dynamic with Sonic, who is initially confused for Shadow, like this is Mysterio pretending to be Spider-Man or something. The two engage in a back-and-forth race of sorts across the entire game, with both heroes and villains gaining power and ground over the other, having their victories that ultimately culminate in the threat of the Bio-Lizard, a greater adversary that brings everyone together. Shadow exists as a foil to Sonic, bereft of hope for humanity, where Sonic values it. Hell, the games even start with Sonic on the run from the authorities, who wish to capture him. Something Shadow experienced decades earlier with the Ark and Gun. Shadow is supposed to be a one-and-done bad guy. You know, he has his redemption arc by the end of the game, and then we see him plummet to his doom, and he sacrifices his life for the good of the planet, becoming a hero in the end. That was supposed to be it for Shadow. It was a surprise when Sonic Heroes came out, and Shadow was once again a playable character. What's interesting is that Sonic Heroes really established this massive world once again. It's not a very well-remembered game. It has a lot of problems. The variety of teams added a real dimension to the various perspectives Sonic's world has. Sonic the Hedgehog was no longer a game just about Sonic the Hedgehog. Even the Game Boy Advance games, which were meant to capture the magic of the original Sega games, they had multiple playable characters, multiple viewpoints. Sonic was not just one singular guy. It was a world. And Sonic Heroes really established that. The Team Dark storyline in Heroes really establishes Shadow's core team. Rouge the Bat and Omega. A Robotnik robot and a triple agent spy. And his adventure is no longer just what does he want to do to destroy the world. It's what's his purpose now that he has changed. What position in the world does he find himself in? That's very existential for really what's ultimately a very simple game. Because everyone else's motivation is just stop Robotnik, find Shadow, fulfill this quota from this mysterious deal that we got ourselves into. Shadow is more aimless and in turn more dynamic and interesting to an audience. He's no longer the villain, but he's lost his place because he's no longer the bad guy. Team Dark's whole thing is that all three of them no longer have a purpose in life, but by coming together, find purpose. Has a real found family vibe to it. And it ends with the idea that Shadow may be a clone, that there may be hundreds, if not thousands, of Shadows around, which opened the door to Shadow the Hedgehog.
Hey, what's up? It's me. Stop!
A game that takes everything Shadow is to an extreme, with diverging paths and mystery and intrigue. Who is Shadow? What's his connections to these aliens? You know, why was he made? And all of that culminates in a game that was kind of mocked on release, I'm not gonna lie.
Shadow the Hedgehog is proof that Sonic Team needs to get with the program if it plans to compete with legitimate current and next generation software. This is Sonic Adventure with guns and less polish, and players today are far more discerning than they were 6 years ago. Die-hard Sonic fans will cling to the fact that the title still conjures up corkscrews and loop-de-loops, as well as an impressive sense of speed when Shadow really gets moving, and this is all true. But this doesn't make up for the game's long list of shortcomings, from stupid level design, unrefined controls, and useless gunplay to disappointingly outdated graphics.
Nowadays it might be a little weird, because I think a lot of kids grew up with this game, and they're like, oh, I love Shadow the Hedgehog, it was so much fun, I had such a great time playing it. When it came out, people were really mocking the crap out of this game. It was a target of mockery and derision. It was so dark and edgy, took everything to such an extreme that it's very clear that they wanted to dial back afterwards. Keep in mind, after Shadow the Hedgehog came out, you got Sonic 06, which has its own problems, but one thing it does not have a problem with is Shadow's role in the story. Shadow is established as, once again, this edgy alternative character who exists on the periphery and acts, finding purpose in his existence and trying to do some good. He's also still uses guns, which has become an iconic element of his character, I guess. Now, Sonic 06 has a ton of problems, but Shadow's story might be the most interesting success from the game. In a lot of ways, it serves as a culmination of all that came before, all the way back to Sonic Adventure 2. The plot of Sonic 06 involves a lot of time travel and interdimensional monsters, but the story with Shadow really works due to its self-actualization focus. I've been leaning on this so far with this video that most of Shadow's storyline has been about him trying to find his own identity. At this point in the story, Shadow has resolved the issues with his past and Black Doom, and he exists beyond just being Sonic's edgy rival. He has a found family with Rouge the Bat and Omega, and is working with Gun, the same organization that attacked the space colony Ark. But, you know, what are you going to do about that? That's fine. Not a big deal. And Sonic 06 starts with this MacGuffin hunt. You know, they fight over the Scepter of Darkness, which turns out to be containing Mephiles the Dark, this eldritch abomination, who manifests as, essentially, a copy of Shadow. So now Shadow has his own edgy counterpart. That's just great. That's fantastic. Anyway, Shadow and Rouge end up traveling into the future, traveling to the past, traveling all throughout this timeline in order to fight Mephiles, who is half of the entity Solaris, the other half being Iblis, who Silver's fighting. That's a whole thing. The real crux of Shadow's story in terms of themes and ideas is how Mephiles feels that he and Shadow are kindred spirits, and should enact revenge against a world that hopes to imprison and use them both for insidious ends.
Let us punish this foolish world of humanity. It's only fair to give back what was intended for you. You have every right to want justice.
That's absurd. Whatever it is you want to do, you can do it alone.
You forgive humanity this folly, then?
I determine my own destiny.
What's fascinating here is that Mephiles is in many ways what Shadow used to be, the rage and hatred towards humanity that he's let go since finding his friends. Of course, this loops around a lot of convoluted time travel shenanigans, but the core of the idea is compelling. Shadow, once a villain, is tempted with a chance to get everything he ever wanted, and he chooses not to. Because he's in a different place in his life than he was when he was first introduced in the story. It really shows growth. I mean, yeah, sure, on paper this reads as, his friends are his power. It's a little cheesy, I know, but it's undeniably a major culmination in Shadow's arc, evolving outside of Sonic's, well, shadow, to confront an enemy on his own terms. It is pretty cool even if it does ultimately lead to that scene where Sonic kisses the princess. But the problem is that while this does establish that Shadow's arc starting from Sonic Adventure 2 is essentially closed, it doesn't open the door for what's next all that much. As we saw in subsequent games, Shadow kind of took on a supporting role. He stopped being a main protagonist and became one of the crew. Sonic 06 also went too far, with the case where Sonic has a romantic relationship with a human princess. That's kind of weird, not gonna lie, but it also plays into this weird surreal nature that started in Sonic Adventure 2 and Sonic Adventure 1. And it's very clear that that was as far as they could push it before they started really dialing it back a bit. While the Adventure to 06 games kind of honed in more on the epic scale with this grand world with these high stakes and, with human characters having tragic interconnections with the hedgehogs and animals, later games tried to dial it back, going more into the classic adventure style that predated Sonic Adventure. Shadow still had a role, but it was far less prominent, and in this weird nebulous era of recovery is where Sonic's surreal nature really came out on the internet. At this point in time, you had a whole generation of kids who grew up with the Sonic Adventure games, and because of that, this weird mishmash of heavy topics with goofy visuals and super serious but also super goofy ideas, it kind of became a melting pot of oddities, and it was not helped by the fact that around this time, two things happened. The rise of fan art becoming publicly available in OCs and kids playing around with ideas, and Sonichu. So, Sonichu. I guess I need to explain this one, since the comic's creator, who, again, I am not naming, is far more well known than the work itself. Now, Sonichu's timeline is a muddled mix of time travel and wish fulfillment, and all these stories really orbit the creator's life and their particular problems and concerns at any given moment. Trolls of the comic appear in the comic and are punished in an incredibly cruel fashion. World problems are solved in a way that's frankly horrifying, and it can only be an optimistic ending when told through the viewpoint of its creator, because it's wish fulfillment, ultimately. It's a world divorced of any other meaningful opinions other than one centralized perspective, we shall say. In context of this discussion, what I want to highlight is how the comic combines fairly adult and, frankly, angry imagery with the set dressing of the Sonic franchise. It's pretty clear when reading Sonichu that Sega made a wise decision to make Shadow only so dark. See, people don't remember this, but there was a substantial push among certain Sonic fans back in the 2000s to make Sonic darker and edgier, in part thanks to the Archie comics, but also due to how Shadow the Hedgehog, the game, pushed the bar a little bit too far in terms of how edgy the games should get.
Where's that damn fourth Chaos Emerald?
What Sonichu does is show how the franchise could have looked like if they pushed it a little too far, even further than that, complete with upping the convoluted time travel nonsense from Sonic 06. And while later games did get darker, we got Sonic Forces, which was widely derided for being so edgy and absurd, among other things. Sonic games tend to hold back mostly, though, from getting too disturbing. You'll never see a Legend of Zelda levels of darkness in Sonic, much less a Silent Hill level of darkness. I think Sonic Frontiers really threaded the needle in terms of maturity mixed with heavier ideas, but most Sonic games that traveled the world of darkness tend to come back more melodramatic than mature. What Sonichu does is show the extreme end of that pipeline, if allowed to go to the extreme end of the path Sega was on. Plus, wish fulfillment. Again, I really can't discuss Sonichu without acknowledging said comic's creator, but I really don't want to dignify said creator with a mention. And keep in mind, I'm someone who made a 4-hour video about Lily Orchard, and I don't want to give this person an ounce of my breath, if possible, so think about that for a second. I am not going to go into the creation of Sonichu, but it is an important chapter in my discussion, because without Sonichu, we wouldn't be pushing discussions as to how far is too far with how you write your narrative. I will not go into Sonichu's creator either, but I will go into the idea that the text became widely ridiculed for being so bizarre and such a personal tract of the creator's own personal grudges and issues with trolls and issues with day-to-day people, that we started to see a surreal blending of how the Sonic franchise could be interpreted and affect audiences. Okay, so Sonic fan games, they're a lot, okay? Like, I don't even know if I feel comfortable showing all that you can do in these games, but rest assured, they tackle the surreal nature of every Sonic game post-adventure, and they shift gears a bit. The Sonic games are melodramas at their heart. They kind of ignore the inherent absurdity of pitting humans against hedgehogs and having these dramatic emotional scenes with governments and guns and all that. But these fan games seem to take a page out of Meat Canyon's closet and make everything this grotesque, quivering horror, taking a look at the absurdity of Sonic and amping it up until it's profoundly unsettling. But horror, as so often it is very closely aligned with comedy. If you make a joke too dreadful and nightmarish, it's terrifying. But if horror becomes too absurd, it's comedic. So, depending on your viewpoint, these grotesque aberrations in these Sonic fan games, they are either absurd or nightmare-inducing. And this isn't even counting Sonic.exe and all those nonsense games, where kids toying with baby's first horror concept try something different. I mean, look, games like Five Nights at Freddy's, they took something that was already inherently creepy like Chuck E. Cheese and just amped up the horror element. Sonic.exe, you're trying to do a Ben Drowned without the subtlety of early Ben Drowned, and you get this hodgepodge of nonsense. So again, we see this reoccurring pattern. Edginess and shock value confused for actual value. But the end result is a lot like Sonichu. It's a work that illustrates the surprisingly clever balance of absurdity and melodrama that the Sonic franchise has stacked in every single game. But the difference here is that these creators sometimes knowingly throw that scale off balance for an intended effect. That effect ultimately being dread and discomfort. DeviantArt, I think, is a little different because that kind of mixed in the strange oddities of the internet that already existed with the fandom community, with the early furry community, with kids playing around with ideas and concepts. And what do they play with? Well, they play with the things that are readily available to them, that being the Sonic franchise, because it was popular with kids. And because of that, a lot of kids' first writing projects were Sonic-based. A lot of their first fan art projects were Sonic-based. Add to that the games themselves were in a bit of a lull. They weren't exactly doing that great. Sonic 06 is widely derided for a very good reason. I think it wasn't until Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations that Sonic kind of got back on the right track in terms of gameplay, only for Sonic Boom to derail it. Sonic Boom, the game, not Sonic Boom, the cartoon. The cartoon's fantastic and also contributed to Sonic becoming more popular with kids, again, creating this timeless, weird cycle. There'd be a terrible Sonic product, but Sonic then would bounce back with something really good maybe a year or two later. You would have this weird cycle where fans would be embarrassed to be Sonic fans before coming back to the fold. During this time, though, Shadow was increasingly hard to spot. Yes, Shadow still appeared, but he wasn't given center frame like he used to be. They kind of tried to dial him back a bit. He'd show up, but he was no longer a secondary protagonist to Sonic. He was no longer on that same level. And I think that's kind of where people started to rediscover and long for Shadow. They missed Shadow. Much like how they missed Sonic during the Sega Saturn era, because there weren't a lot of good Sonic games, people started to miss Shadow, because Shadow was no longer a big role in the narrative. I think also another factor that's undeniable with all this is the Snap Cube dub.
He fucked my wife, so guess what? I'm gonna fuck the Earth! That's right, this is what you get! My super laser piss! Except I'm not gonna piss on the Earth. I'm gonna go higher. I'm pissing on the moon!
The Snapcube fandub of Sonic is a vital chapter in this modern Sonic fandom. Snapcube's fandub built all these great in-jokes with the characters. It really reinterpreted and reinvigorated interest in these older games in a way that I think mainstream Sega just couldn't do. And it brought us back to an era that these creators grew up with. Their jokes were authentically really funny, and it took some of the more cringy elements and turned them into something beloved.
Why don't you tell me your incredibly complicated backstory in an interesting, long-winded monologue, complete with background visuals?
Oh, okay, yes. So, once upon a time...
Yeah, one.
It took the surreality of everything and turned it into a feature rather than a bug, which is kind of what Sonic fandom has been doing for a while. There's that really good Super Eye Patch Wolf video where he takes a look at Sonic's very surreal existence in modern fandom. There were a lot of fan games and a lot of weird mimetic things that played with the strange humor of this world in a way that I think is very compelling and very interesting. But again, I think what it comes down to also is how we connect with cringe. Cringe culture is alive and well. We take a look at things that are odd and unusual, and they're subjects of ridicule and derision. People just expressing their opinions, talking openly about feelings and thoughts. Sometimes what happens is they're derided, they're mocked. Because in life, things are clumsy. In life, people make errors. They don't always know what they're supposed to say in the right way to do it. Writing issues can sometimes be picked apart and mocked. Because, hey, when something isn't well written or something is clumsy, sometimes it is awkward. Sometimes it is weird and wonky and doesn't always make sense. But with Shadow the Hedgehog, it's interesting because Shadow was, by its very nature, clunky. It was clumsy. It took these heavy ideas, but inserted them into a world where hedgehogs ran really fast, and people could get hit with hammers, and little birds flew out of machines that broke apart. In many ways, Shadow embodies the tropes of the Mary Sue, a character who's just super better than everyone else, so cool, everyone likes them, or everyone fears them, and such and such and such, at least superficially. Shadow's not a Mary Sue. I mean, he gets killed at the end of his own game. A Mary Sue would just survive and rise above everything or resurrect himself. Well, Shadow did that too, actually. So, Sonic and Mary Sues, they have a surprising amount in common. Now, let's go over some stereotypical Sue traits and see which applies to Shadows. And for this, so I can cite my sources, I'm referencing TV tropes as common Mary Sue traits. And obviously, I'm cherry picking here because obviously Shadow is not a Mary Sue. I just wanted to make a point here that Shadow does have a lot in common with the stereotypical Mary Sue seen in young writers' creations. So, Shadow has a dark and troubled past that amps up the angst factor dramatically. Every single moment seems to be a moment to recall the tragedy, to reference the pain of Maria's loss, until Shadow undergoes his character arc. Shadow is also presented as the ultimate life form, which just means he completely lacks any and all traditional flaws by its very nature. Characters like Rouge the Bat and Omega are inexplicably drawn to Shadow, as well as Sonic's friend group, who, despite Shadow and Sonic initially being enemies, they're kind of become companions over time, and later games kind of forget that Shadow was ever a villain. Shadow basically succeeds at everything he sets his mind to, and only undercuts his plans when he chooses to. Case in point, when in Sonic Adventure 2, he creates a scenario that leads to the destruction of the Earth. That plan only stops because Shadow changes his mind. If Shadow didn't change his mind, the Space Colony Ark would have crashed into Earth, destroying everything. Even then, sometimes the mechanics of the world bend around him. Take Sonic 06, for example. In Sonic 06, there's one point where Rouge the Bat uses Omega to bring a Chaos Emerald to Shadow, while Shadow is in the future fighting Mephiles. This scene makes no sense, really, if you think about time travel mechanics, because we know Omega is already on a set path, and Shadow existing past that set path can't exist in a timeline where Omega was changed in the past to reflect the future without he himself in the future being affected otherwise. But it's very strange and very odd, but, whatever, who cares? As for inexplicable powers, let's be honest, Chaos Control is such a strange, vaguely defined power set. It stops time, it can fire bolts of energy, it can be used for destructive ends, but ultimately it feels like a vague reality-breaking power that just happens to usually be made to make Shadow even faster than before. In a series where speed is a metric of power, that's substantial. Oh, and spoilers for Sonic X Shadow Generations, but Shadow gets alien wings, completing his transformation into every early 2000s weeb's dark and edgy OC. I'm not saying Shadow's a Mary Sue. I think it's a dumb insult to make. But I'm saying there was a lot of tropes that people associated with Mary Sues that you could associate with Shadow. But Shadow full-heartedly embraced them. The character was never treated ironically or as a joke in the Sonic games. All of this was done with complete sincerity. Shadow owes a degree of success to just how overt and how unapologetic he is in his edginess, in his darkness, in his extremeness. And I think a lot of kids resonate with that growing up. They were drawn unironically to the darkness because it's one of the first times they might have seen it. A lot of kids weren't watching edgy anime when they were 7, but they did play Sonic, and that proved to appeal to them in a way that this edgy material could, but they just weren't old enough to see. And as they got into edgier stuff, that still resonated with them. They can go back to Sonic and go, I like Sasuke Uchiha, but I also like Shadow the Hedgehog. You know, that was the kind of pipeline these kids went through. And over time, you know, it became cringy. Like, oh, I liked this thing as a kid. I can't believe I like it anymore. But in the modern era, because Sonic has been reclaimed by so many online media personalities, video projects, fan games, memes, they've become accepting of Shadow. Shadow is cringe, but he's also free. He's able to do what he needs to do because he has no shame about what he is. He is completely and utterly liberated from the standards of taste-making. Shadow was made to be cool in the mid-2000s, the early 2000s, but because he's so unchanging, he's still cool today. He's cringe, but he's cool, because Shadow doesn't give a fuck what anyone thinks, and that's kind of great. It's the kind of mentality I think people are drawn to now more than ever before. The sense that this is someone who is dark, edgy, has a tragic backstory. He's everything I should be making fun of, but he's done so unapologetically and so uncompromisingly that it's kind of appealing. A lot of people criticize the MCU and stuff like that for having this ironic sense of self-awareness, kind of poking fun at how silly the whole thing is. That's not true for Shadow. Shadow doesn't crack jokes. He is so self-serious that the self-seriousness becomes a joke in surrounding media and with other characters, but he himself takes himself completely at face value. And there's something kind of to love about that. I really hope Sonic the Hedgehog 3 turns out to be great, because I would love to see more Keanu Reeves riding motorcycles, doing chaos control while firing guns akimbo everywhere. That would be great. And I hope this starts a trend of media not being afraid of being cringe, because people hold themselves back so often because they're afraid of looking silly. If we just forget that and keep pushing forward regardless, you too will be cringe, but you will also be free.